The campaign for Virginia governor has divided voters along demographic lines highly reminiscent of last November's presidential election, according to a New York Times Upshot Siena College poll on Sunday, and the Democrat, Ralph Northam, holds a modest 3-point lead over the Republican Ed Gillespie, 43% to 40%. It is the latest poll to show a tight race. The election is Tuesday, and the poll was conducted October 29 to Thursday, a period when Mr. Northam made headlines for saying he would sign a bill to ban so-called sanctuary cities from becoming a possibility in Virginia. The campaign has been dominated by hot-button racial and cultural issues. Sanctuary cities, Confederate monuments and the MS-13 gang have all played a prominent role in Mr. Gillespie's advertisements. Unsurprisingly, these issues have split voters by race and education. White voters without a college degree backed Mr. Gillespie by a 40-point margin in the poll, 63% to 23%, while non-white voters backed Mr. Northam by a similar margin, 65 to 17. Mr. Northam holds roughly a 10-point lead among college-educated white voters, enough to give him the edge statewide. But neither Mr. Northam nor Mr. Gillespie appears to be matching Donald J. Trump or Hillary Clinton's huge margins among the strongest demographic groups. The poll asked respondents how they voted in last year's presidential race, and there was a consistent pattern across demographic groups and geography. The governor's race, although reminiscent of 2016 HASNT, quite polarized voters to the same extent. White working-class voters said they backed Mr. Trump by a 48-point margin, 67% to 19%, somewhat wider than Mr. Gillespie's 40-point edge. Mr. Northam holds a 26-point lead among voters from Northern Virginia. Voters from that area said they backed Mrs. Clinton by 31 points. It's a pattern up and down the ballot. The pattern has also been fairly common beyond Virginia this year. In special congressional elections, Republicans have fallen far short of Mr. Trump's strong showing in white working-class areas, while Democrats have struggled to exceed Mrs. Clinton's showing in the areas where she excelled, like Georgia's 6th congressional district. But the Virginia contest seems to have a distinct dynamic. Mr. Gillespie, with establishment roots as a former chairman of the Republican National Committee, has run a campaign plainly intended to rally Mr. Trump's supporters, making the question of whether he can approach Mr. Trump's strong tallies somewhat more interesting. If Mr. Gillespie prevails or runs well ahead of Mr. Trump, it might be interpreted as a sign that establishment Republicans can excel by embracing Mr. Trump's message. According to this view, they could lure white working-class Trump supporters with his message on race and immigration, while maintaining greater support among well-educated voters with their establishment-friendly credentials and tone. Even if Mr. Gillespie loses by a small margin, his campaign could be judged a success given national political conditions and Virginia's Democratic lean. Mr. Northam entered the race as a clear, if modest, favorite. Virginia, with a high percentage of college-educated voters, backed Mrs. Clinton by a 5-point margin in November, and the national political environment would seem to be very favorable to a Democrat. The party out of power has generally won the Virginia governor's race, and Republicans have underperformed in this year's special elections. Mr. Trump's approval rating has consistently been in the 30s, and Democrats have a considerable lead on the generic congressional ballot. These conditions are consistent with a so-called wave election, like the ones that swept Democrats into power in the House in 2006 and back out in 2010. But Mr. Trump's approval rating was at 39% in the Upshot Siena survey, with his disapproval at 51%. These figures are somewhat better for Mr. Trump than those of most other surveys, perhaps in part because this poll tries to capture likely voters in an off-year election, and those voters are considerably older and whiter than the overall adult population. The poll was sampled from an L2 voter file, and it's weighted to a likely electorate. It supposes a turnout of around 2.4 million votes, up somewhat from the 2.24 million cast in the 2013 governor's race. But higher or lower turnout would not necessarily be a clear advantage for either side, according to our results. The Democratic strength among well-educated voters, and the robust Democratic turnout in the primary for this race, gives the party more strength among high-turnout voters than has been the case in recent elections. About 14% of respondents were undecided or refused to answer, while another 2% backed the Libertarian candidate Cliff Hyra. The relatively high proportion of undecided voters is partly because the sample includes a large number of less likely voters, who are vastly more likely to be undecided than the likeliest voters. Many public polls sample only frequent voters, or screen the sample down to the likeliest voters. Mr. Northam would have led by 3 points, 46 to 43, if the sample had counted only voters who were almost sure or very likely to vote. How the poll has changed. The poll is the first Upshot Siena survey since the 2016 presidential election, when polls generally overstated Mrs. Clinton's support in the decisive battleground states. Mr. Trump led by 4 points in our final Florida survey in 2016, and he was tied in our final North Carolina survey. But the Upshot Siena survey also had Mrs. Clinton up by 7 points in earlier polls of North Carolina and Pennsylvania, taken soon after the third debate, when she still had a wide lead in national and battleground state polls. The apparent shifts over the last few weeks of the race make it more difficult to assess the performance of these surveys. But a close analysis of last year's surveys, combined with insights from across the survey industry, has helped inform 2 initial changes to the Upshot Siena poll since last November's election. First, the poll is weighted by self-reported education to match estimates based on the census current population survey. There's considerable evidence that the failure to weight by education was a major reason state pre-election polls were off the mark, especially in the Rust Belt states. It's not so clear that education weighting would have considerably improved the performance of Upshot Siena surveys. That's because the Upshot Siena sample design and weighting scheme was already intended to properly represent low-turnout voters, who tend to be less educated. The education weight had no effect on the results of this Virginia survey. Second, we sampled and weighted to a likely electorate, rather than registered voters. Similarly, the model turnout score, our estimate for the probability that a voter will turn out, based on past voting record and other measures, now represents 60% of our estimate that a respondent will turn out, up from 50% in 2016. The remaining 40% of the estimate is based on respondents' answers to several questions about their interest in politics, the coming election and their intention to vote. Overall, these changes would have eliminated about half of the bias and 1/3 of the error in our final 3 surveys in 2016. That may not be generalizable to other elections. The methodology, crosstabs and the composition of the electorate are available on GitHub.